Hello, everyone. I hope you're all happy and healthy along with your respected families where we're located on this God's green earth. Welcome to today's episode of the Real Talks with Amini, and I am honored to be joined by Dr. Robert Farley, a distinguished expert of international security affairs, U.S. foreign policy, professor of Patterson School at University of Kentucky, widely cited author and commentator on global affairs. We'll be talking with him on the U.S. Foreign policy under Trump administration, the second Trump administration, and how it affects various hot spots around the world in Ukraine, Russia, Middle East, China, as well as South Asia. So be with us. It will be a very fascinating conversation. Welcome, Dr. Farley, on the show. Thank you very much for your time. We are honored to have you. Maybe we can start by having your assessment or an overview of comparative overview of the U.S. foreign policy under the second Trump administration vis-a-vis the first Trump administration. Do you see there are distinctions there, or you see the second Trump administration basically a continuation of the first Trump administration?
Well, first, I'm delighted to be here. It's an honor to be here, and thank you for inviting me. With respect to the two Trump administrations, I think I like to think about it in terms of distinguishing between Trump 45 and Trump 47, right? I think that makes it a lot more sort of intellectually pliable in trying to divide those two. I don't think there's any question that there has been a substantial shift for Trump 47 from what was happening in Trump 45. Part of this has to do with a different understanding of how to deal with personnel and how to deal with the bureaucracy. And Trump 47 has been much more aggressive about putting his own personnel, people who are going to be loyal to him, people who aren't going to gum up the works, into positions of authority. So Trump 45 was characterized by both a lot of lack of expertise, but also by Trump essentially, putting people who were supposed to have subject matter expertise into positions of responsibility, who then weren't necessarily loyal to doing the things that he wanted to do, right? And that really slowed down the kind of shifts he wanted to make in defense policy and economic statecraft in other areas. And so, what we have seen this time around is he has been much more aggressive about controlling with his own people, with MAGA folks, not with sort of traditional long-term Republicans, Republican foreign policy hands, with MAGA folks to put into positions of responsibility and make the kind of change in the bureaucracy that he wants to make.
I see. And how do you compare Trump's second term in terms of its focus on strategic affairs and foreign policy around the world with Biden's 4-year term? Are there significant shifts you're seeing?
So there are aspects of continuity that run between 45, 46, and 47, right? The emphasis on foreign policy, economic statecraft is a big one, right? That was very important for Trump 45. It was something that was not rejected or pushed back on by Biden 46, right? That many of the tariffs, low-level tariffs that Trump had installed that Trump 45 had installed remained in place during the Biden administration. But now they have been exploded, right? They have been sort of vastly increased. I think that in the end, the biggest shift from not simply Trump 47 from Biden 46, but really Trump 47 from the Cold War consensus is the explosion of USAID, the explosion of other sort of very substantial portions of the foreign policy bureaucracy, which have had, I think, an immense impact within the federal government and the foreign policy apparatus of the federal government, but are also having immense effects abroad. So I think that's really the big deal and the big change from 46 from Trump 45 to Biden 46 to Trump 47 is really the disassembly of the foreign policy bureaucracy that was built up during the Cold War and that had been part of how the United States has done foreign policy for decades. And that's really the revolutionary shift that we're seeing from Trump 47.
I see. And what is the America First agenda basically mean? How does it translate in terms of foreign policy and tackling issues that sometimes require not just unilateral approach by the United States, but also multilateral approach or various conflicts around the world?
America First is a slogan. It is intended for a domestic audience, right? I think that countries around the world, pretty much every country in the world other than the United States, would be extremely surprised to find that for the past 6 decades, the United States has not put America first, right? From the perspective of the rest of the world, it's been America first for a good long while now. And that's true even in the case of things that sort of America First detests, like USAID, right, and so forth, right? That these things were arms of American influence, right? That they were ways in which the United States managed the world, managed its neighborhood, managed distant areas, subverted countries, reinforced certain kinds of governments and so forth, right? All of these were arms of American power. America First as a slogan, right? I understand its importance and value in domestic politics, right? But for people who work in foreign policy, it doesn't really make any sense, right? So I think that sort of what we can derive from it is it means we take alliances less seriously. We take the needs of partners less seriously. We challenge even long-term relationships and change how long-term relationships are done, where we sort of use as much U.S. leverage as possible, even in long-term partners like South Korea, Japan, Europe, the United Kingdom. We leverage the size and power of the U.S. market to drive up tariffs, to wring out other kinds of concessions in security policy and economic policy. And so that's what America First means to this administration, right? It means using American leverage in a particular way that sort of disdains tools of multilateralism, disdains tools of cooperation that had been part of the U.S. foreign policy arsenal for a really long time. I don't think it's a change in terms of America putting itself first, because I think America has for a long time put itself first.
Yeah, and maybe that's for the good of the world. I mean, the world needs leadership, and America is there to lead. So maybe we can discuss how the new administration has been approaching Ukraine compared to the previous administration. Maybe that will give us a good sense of where they're heading in terms of dealing with Moscow's aggression in Europe and around the world. What do you think? The strategic thinking in the White House has shifted from not doing anything to do with Ukraine and now doing a lot of things with Ukraine, but also at the same time expecting to see there as a peaceful resolution, but at the same time getting ready for punishing Moscow. What do you think we are heading towards?
So I think that the administration very slowly came to the conclusion, right, that when the administration, both during the campaign in 2024 and also during the interregnum between Biden and Trump, the administration was pretty committed to the belief that the primary obstacle to peace between Russia and Ukraine. I actually take President Trump at his word when he says that he wants peace between Russia and Ukraine. I want peace between Russia and Ukraine. It just depends on what terms peace can be had. And I think that President Trump and others in his circle were of the view in January of 2025 that the primary obstacle to peace was Ukraine and President Zelensky. That has been reflected in a lot of different work that's been done. We all remember the big conflict in the Oval Office. And so it's absolutely certain, it's absolutely true that there is friction between the United States and Ukraine. But I think that what the administration has found is that fundamentally it's not Ukraine preventing a peace from happening between Russia and Ukraine. Yes, Ukraine has demands that are significant. Ukraine probably has demands that are unrealistic, but Ukraine is willing to talk about those, right? And Ukraine has repeatedly evinced a willingness to talk about those. And Russia has not, right? Russia has met Ukrainian concessions with accelerated demands. And, it's not obvious. It wasn't obvious that that was going to happen, that that was going to be the result of the diplomatic outreach of the administration. But Russia has evidently calculated that this administration has a limited commitment to Ukraine, that the Europeans have limits to their capabilities, and therefore it's going to press for victory, right? So I think in terms of the Trump administration, you've had a pretty profound rethink in how this crisis actually operates, right? Whereas before you had a lot of sort of relative sympathy for Russia's position, that sympathy has really, I think, drained away. I don't think that it has yet been replaced by sympathy for Ukraine's position, right? But I do think that there is an understanding that if you really want the war to end, the war is unlikely to end on the sorts of demands that Russia is making. So Russia has to be convinced that it's not worth the price it will have to pay to win an ultimate victory. And so that, I think, now is the thinking that's really characterizing how this administration is approaching it. And so we're seeing a facilitation of European arms transfers to Ukraine. We're seeing continued intelligence cooperation with Ukraine, and a much friendlier relationship between Washington and Kyiv than we had 3 or 4 months ago. I wouldn't call it necessarily switching sides. What I would say is that the administration is taking a different approach to trying to end the war than the one it thought would work in January of 2025.
I see. And what do you think would be the implication for the basically the great power competition that is going on between Russia and the United States with how this conflict in Ukraine is going to get concluded in terms of how many concessions are going to give we're going to give to Moscow or not? Do you think it's going to be defining the terms of the power struggle dynamic in the world when the conflict resolves?
Well, that's an interesting question. It's interesting that you use the terminology great power competition. Um, the problem is that apart from its nuclear weapons,
Mhm.
Russia is not a great power,
Mm.
right? That, the Russian economy is small, and it looks like it's getting smaller now. Russia's demographics are appalling, and Russia is struggling to defeat a much smaller country that's right on its border, right? So, I honestly don't really think of this war as being a war of great power competition, right? Although, you can certainly frame it that way, right? Um, and in fact, I think that the Biden administration was entirely ready to watch as Moscow rolled over Kyiv in February of 2022 and just sort of complain about it, right? And what changed that was the tenacity of the Ukrainians. Um, I mean, I think that the long-term answer in terms of how this war plays out and the sort of concessions that are made, the overall global implications are probably less than people think. I definitely think that Russia is being driven more closely into China's orbit, but I think that that was very likely anyway, both for ideological and for economic reasons. I think that the rupture between the Russians and the Europeans is as complete now as it's ever going to be. Um, you know, you certainly have interesting politics in Europe with respect to the Russians, but you also have a lot more interest in defense spending. You have a lot more interest in mutual defense. And even with the United States to drop out of NATO, I think NATO would continue to exist. Really in the end, the biggest implications and the biggest results from this war are going to be for the people of Russia and Ukraine, right? Will Ukraine be allowed to continue its democracy, to maintain its democracy? Will it get security guarantees? What will Russian society, what will the Russian economy look like after the end of this? Will Russia ever be able to be successfully rehabilitated into international society? Those are the questions I think that are relevant here. You know, great power competition, you have to have great powers, right? And right now, as far as I can tell, you have two great powers in the world, and those are the United States and the People's Republic of China. So,
I see. So we'll get to China in a second, but maybe we can go to Middle East. and
Mhm.
get your perspective on various situations there. A lot has happened. The Assad regime fell. We saw the conflict with Hezbollah, how that
Mhm.
has been disseminated by Israel. We see some skirmishes with Houthis, and then we saw with the Iranian conflict between Israel and Iran, and how U.S. took decisive action. What do you think is the security architecture in the Middle East is moving towards in a direction where the US and Israel are going to be prominently defining actors in the region, and other actors will follow?
I mean, I would say that's a great question. It is a great question, but it would also be a great question to ask at any point in the last 75 years, right?
Mhm.
Um, because you yourself, you're quite aware of the unpredictability of politics in this region. You're also aware, and I think everyone is aware of how the politics and conflicts of this region draw in external partners. Um, I think that for everything that you can say about all the stuff that happened, about what the world was like on October 6th, 2023, that October 7th, 2023 is a major inflection point in Middle Eastern politics.
Mhm.
Um, and in part because it was so unexpected, that it didn't seem inevitable. It seems like just this moment where everything changed. And I understand. Right. For Palestinians, that's not really the case, right? For Palestinians, they understand October 7th to be sort of the necessary long-term response to Israeli aggression, right? But also a lot of people, even in Palestinian circles, didn't expect October 7th to happen, didn't expect it to happen in the way they want, in the way that it did.
Mhm.
Um, you know, I mean, Israel has, with US support and with the toleration of the Gulf monarchies, and I think that last point is really important because a lot of this stuff doesn't happen if the Gulf monarchies are working in active opposition to Israel, right? But they have chosen to tolerate Israel's activity. Israel has really rewritten the strategic map of the Middle East since October 7th, right? So, as you mentioned, the substantial destruction of Hamas, right? We know that Hamas fighters are still there, but it's a shadow of its former self. The pummeling of Gaza. I won't go into sort of all the questions about the G word and genocide with respect to Gaza, or war crimes, right? But certainly a human catastrophe that has been caused in Gaza, but that has also shored up Israel's security. The substantial destruction, the neutering of Hezbollah in Lebanon, which I don't think anybody expected to be conducted with the efficiency that it was, where top echelons of Hezbollah and much of Hezbollah's military capability was erased over a few weeks.
Mhm.
The collapse of the Assad regime, right, which certainly I think has this relationship with what's happening in Russia, because Russia was unable or unwilling to come to Assad's aid in the ways that Russia has done in the past.
Mhm.
Um, the Houthis you mentioned, and then what we're now calling, I think, the 12-day war, right, which is this a very short, very sharp war between Iran and Israel that, generally speaking, I think people believe that Israel, with the assistance of the United States, won. Although we're going to have a lot of conversations about whether Israel won the war enough,
Mhm.
right? And that depends to a great extent on what Iran's nuclear program looks like. But yeah, I mean, it has been transformative of the region. It has placed Israel into a position where direct military threats to Israel's existence are smaller than they have been really since Israel became a state. It hasn't really resulted in balancing behavior yet, right? So people don't seem to be balancing against Israeli strength in the Middle East like you would expect that they might. I mean, there have been some noises out of Saudi Arabia and some of the Gulf monarchies that the Israelis may be getting a little bit too big. Um, but I mean, really the political and security and military situation now, as compared to October 6th, 2003, favors Israel far more heavily and favors Iran far less than it did. And that is working changes, I think, in Israel, certainly in Palestine, certainly in Iran. There's much that still has to be done in Syria. So there's still war, there's still fighting, there's still destruction. But it is profoundly different than it was on October 6th, 2023.
Yeah. If we can just pause for a moment on the October 7th attack, the way it happened, the largest scale terrorist attack on Israel,
Mhm.
in a way that the Israel has had many successes afterwards, but on that particular instance, it was a big failure on the part of
Mhm.
Israeli entities who had claimed to have massive resources and personnel and surveillance capabilities and technology and so much investments in the region, but they haven't been able to, or they failed to detect this threat that was happening just next door. And on top of that, it wasn't just the entities in Israel, but also global entities who failed to detect such a large scale terrorist attack. Do you think that the relevant entities have learned their lesson of, at a time when they came out and claiming that, oh, the terrorist threat may not be as big of a deal in the world, all of a sudden we saw October 7th. Do you think they've recalibrated their focus on terrorism, on how they're watching terrorist entities and making sure we never see such an attack again?
So, I mean, I think this is a fantastic question, right? Because, um, you know, after February of 2022, right, when Russia, attempted to launch a surprise attack against Ukraine, and everybody knew it was going to happen, right? To the extent the Ukrainians didn't know it was going to happen is because they fooled themselves into thinking it wasn't going to happen, right? But the United States is broadcasting that this is going to happen, right? Um, the people began to think, well, we can't really do surprise attacks anymore, right? Surprise attacks in this information environment, right, where there is so much visualization of data, where you have AI interpreting and analyzing data, where communications are sifted through with a fine tooth comb. You can't really do surprises anymore. And then Sinwar comes through with an attack that was evidently a complete surprise to the Israelis, despite the fact that there had been ample preparation. And I want to add here a complete surprise to the Israelis and also a complete surprise to the United States, right? Um, the books will eventually be written about this, but I haven't seen any real information which says that U.S. intelligence agencies were communicating with their Israeli counterparts and saying, something's going to happen, the lights are blaring red. It doesn't seem like we knew it was going to happen either. And I mean, this is, and we teach intelligence at the Patterson School, and so you're familiar with a lot of this, right? Um, fundamentally, it comes down to this, right? You can have the best optics in the world. You can have the best surveillance, the most sophisticated capabilities, the smartest people, but if you're looking in the wrong direction, you're not going to see something coming, right? And I think before October 7th, the Israelis were looking in the wrong direction, right? They simply did not anticipate that there was going to be an attack. And you know, the sources of that failure are really complex and have a lot to do with Israeli society and the Israeli government, but the United States as well, right? I mean, I think were we to go back and into the Biden administration and say, what is one thing that you would change? Right. What I would ask the Biden administration to do is to say, pay attention to what's going on the Gaza Strip on October 5th, right, 2023, and October 6th, 2023. Because if you can stop that from happening, then you stop this massive cascade that ends up destroying the Biden administration or creating major problems for the Biden administration, right? And so, it's an injunction to people to think about intelligence in more sophisticated ways. Because if you can stop that from happening, then you can stop really tragic sort of cascades of events.
That's true. That's true. Very well put. So hopefully people have gotten their relevant entities have gotten their lessons. So hopefully we will never see such an attack,
Mhm.
such tragedy again. So going back to Iran, what do you think is now the situation in terms of their capabilities, in terms of their outlook, their rhetoric, of wiping Israel out of the world map? Do you think they've changed, or you think that the leadership is still insisting on their dogmatic ideology and anti-Israeli, anti-West narrative that they have been fueling for the past 4 decades?
Well, I mean, I don't think that Iran's fundamental orientation is going to change. there is always this question of, to what extent are these values strongly held by Iranian elites, by Iranian foreign policy elites, and to what extent are they held strategically and rhetorically in order to improve Iran's position across the Middle East, right? And the answer is both, right? The answer has to be both, right? So that you invest in Hezbollah, you invest in Hamas, you invest in the Houthis, and so forth. And you found that investment around an ideology of strong anti-Israel thinking, right? And that allows you to maintain those relationships and allows you to generate military power, right? Coercive military power. Um, I mean, the Israelis really hoped, I think they really hoped that the 12-day war was going to end the Islamic Republic.
Mhm.
That was a silly thing to hope, but I think they really hoped it. Um, I mean, I think the Iranians may take different routes they may use different methods, but I don't think fundamentally that the 12-day war has solved the problem of Iran for Israel.
Mhm.
I think you are going to still see a desire for revenge. You're still going to see a desire for regime legitimization in terms of the Iranian regime talking about the destruction of Israel. And so, I don't think that those things are going to change. They may be more muted, right? They may be quieter for a while.
Mhm.
They may change after Iran develops a nuclear weapon, right? We don't know if Iran still has the capability or still has the interest of developing a nuclear weapon, but it's certainly possible.
Right.
So, um, I think there is they have a lot of work to do,
Mhm.
right, in Iran, but I don't think fundamentally there is an ideological shift yet in how the regime views its place and Israel's place in the Middle East.
Right. And given the fact that I'm also seeing the same thing, that there is no shift, they're still having the same rhetoric post the war against Israel, against the West, and beating the same drums. Do you think there's the possibility or viability of the possible people's uprising among Iranians to rise up against the clerics in Tehran with the support from the West and
Mhm.
or Israel? Or do you think there are enough interest in Western capitals to invest in such a scenario of to making sure that they change the regime in Iran, basically?
I don't think that there's very much interest at all in Western capitals for investing in regime change in Tehran. And I think there's a bunch of reasons for that. One, there's just there it's a very difficult road to hoe, right? It's a very difficult haul in terms of thinking about regime change and in terms of trying to bring down an autocratic regime. We can speculate all we want, and people have been speculating and talking for the past 40 years. How strong is the hold of the Iranian regime of the Islamic Republic over the people of Iran? And this is a regime that has weathered many challenges, right? Both internally and externally over its history. Yeah. Other countries too, right, have weathered challenges and then collapsed, right? But this doesn't look to me like a regime that is coasting towards collapse anytime soon, right? And the United States evidently did not believe that an extra push this time around, right, after U.S. Air Force dropped bombs on Iran, did not believe that an extra push would be sufficient to bring down the regime. And the second problem I think that folks have is that uh, unless you're Israel, right, or unless you're possibly some of the Gulf monarchies, although the Gulf monarchies there's also an indication that they're willing to make their peace with Tehran.
Mhm.
Um, the Islamic Republic is bad and it does terrorism. It conducts terrorist attacks all over the world, right? I mean, it's not a good citizen, right? It sells weapons to Russia, blah, blah, blah. But there's also an element of the devil you know versus the devil you don't know, right? We don't know what would replace the Islamic Republic, right? We know that the collapse of the authoritarian Shah regime led to something that most people in the West viewed as worse, right?
Mhm.
Um, it can always get worse, right? And so the idea that whatever would emerge from the tumult of another revolution in Iran would be something better is something that I think a lot of people in the West worry about, right? We worry about that right now and we still don't really have an answer with Syria,
Hmm.
right? With the new regime in Syria, right? We know it's weaker, right? But yeah, it's tough to say what would come after a revolution that overthrew the Islamic Republic. And because Iran is such a pivotal state in terms of the global economy, um, it's a big risk, right? It's a big risk to invest in this idea of regime change.
Yeah. Yeah, I know there are a lot of Iranian dissidents and the diaspora who are trying very hard to bring about the regime change. And from there, what I hear from them is that they see a possibility of a democratic Iran, a true democracy that could be an ally of the West and ally of Israel in the region. And if they could succeed and that scenario could come about, I think that will be great. But as you said, it's very difficult to say what comes next.
Well, and I'll pause you there, right? Because I've talked to a lot of Israelis, and they don't want a democratic Iran.
Hmm.
Right? Israelis want the Shah of Iran back,
Hmm.
right? The Shah of Iran, who was an authoritarian leader, but who was friendly with Israel, was friendly with the West, was friendly with the United States. That's what the Israelis want,
Hmm.
right? The Israelis don't want a democratic Iran because they fear that a truly democratic Iran will be just as hostile to Israel as the current Iranian regime is, but that it will have more legitimacy and more capability, and it will be harder to make a case against it in the West.
Yeah.
And, this is represented in a lot of foreign policy organizations that are Israel supporting, is there's not that much enthusiasm for an actually democratic Iranian regime.
Yeah, I hope that countries around the world trust the people's wisdom. If there is real democracy, if the people really have the power, not just fake democracy, like right now, Iranians claim that they are a democracy, but they are not. If they are a real democracy, I'm confident that the people will make the right decision, and the decision would be to have friendly relationships with the world. That the people of no country want to have animosity based on ideology or religion or whatever. I mean, these are people want to have a good life, and I know that the Iranians want to have a good life and want to live in peace with the world. It's the clerics, it's the officials in charge who always misrepresent the people's interests and direct them in a way that is detrimental to the interests of the people as well. But let's see what happens.
Right.
What do you think of the efforts like Abraham Accords and other efforts in terms of normalization between Israel and other Gulf countries? Do you think those efforts are going to have as much of an impact in terms of resolving some of these conflicts or addressing some of these threats that are faced by Israel? Or you think at the end of the day, it all comes down to airstrikes and operations?
I mean, I think the Abraham Accords were important. I think that Saudi-Israeli normalization would be important, right? Were it to happen. But I think that we make the mistake of framing the Arab-Israeli conflict as an Arab-Israeli conflict, right? When in fact, for most of the Arab-Israeli conflict, even since 1948, the countries that you're talking about with respect to the Abraham Accords, the Gulf monarchies, which are the ones that really have the capabilities, the financial capabilities, and the ones that have been targeted by the Trump administration and by the Biden administration, because the relations between Biden and Saudi Arabia were difficult at times, right? But it was still regarded as important to bring the Saudis in. Um, None of the Gulf monarchies have ever been enthusiastic about fighting Israel, right? And this goes back almost to 1948. So, yes, they may have participated in these wars. Yes, they may have been supportive of these wars. But the people who have fought and died against Israel, really since 1948, have been Syrians, Palestinians, Egyptians, Lebanese, right, primarily, right? Few Iraqis here and there, some Jordanians here and there, but not Saudi Arabia, right? Not even really Yemen, right? Not Oman, right? Not all of the other countries of the Gulf, right? They may have made noises about being anti-Israel, but they have not really backed those noises up. So this does not mean that the Abraham Accords weren't important, right? Because taking something informal and turning it into something formal, I think, is important, right? And that can be a big deal, right? It's just not transformative. And I am skeptical that really the efforts, really the bipartisan efforts, because the Biden administration found it very important too, to bring out bring together normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia, I don't think that's really going to solve every problem in the Middle East either in the way that people have wanted
Yeah.
it to be. So it's important, but not revolutionary would be my answer.
Sure, sure. And what do you think about Qatar? I mean, it's really frustrating to see a country that is an ally of the US in the region, but at the same time, an ally of IRGC in Iran, an ally of Hamas, an ally of Taliban terrorists, and all of the bad actors basically in the region or just or in Doha or passing through Doha. What do you think is going to be the end state in terms of dealing with such a monarchy or such a country? Do you think democratization of that country would be a solution, or what could be the resolution to have such a strategically located country play more of a constructive and positive role in the world?
Well, I think Qatar's position would be first, I think that democracy is probably a non-starter, right? Just because of, I mean, I think the regime is really popular and is incredibly well resourced and is such a linchpin that nobody wants to see it collapse, right? Nobody wants to see it fall apart. Um, I mean, I think the argument that Qatar would make, right, is that they are in fact pursuing a responsible foreign policy, right? They are pursuing a constructive and responsible foreign policy because organizations like Hamas exist, right? They exist in the real world and somebody has to talk with them. The Islamic Republic exists in the world and somebody has to talk with it. The Taliban exists in the world and somebody has to talk with it, right? And if the channels that Qatar has cultivated so carefully, right? Not only with those regimes, but also with the United States, right? Also with the other Gulf monarchies, although, as you know, there are tensions, right? Um, that, if we did not have the diplomatic channels and the diplomatic expertise and the long-term relationships that Qatar has cultivated for such a long time, everything would be worse,
Yeah,
right? Um, Now, you may not find that argument very satisfying, right? I find it satisfying to a point, right? I mean, as long as Iran is there, we have to talk with Iran, right? Um, we have to come up with ways to talk to Hamas when we need to talk to Hamas, right? And frankly, and maybe we'll talk about this more, I think maybe towards the end, right? Um, as long as the Taliban controls Kabul, right, there has to be a way of talking, right? Because there are issues that have to be resolved, right? And they have to be resolved, and the Taliban is not going to collapse tomorrow, but we have to talk about these tomorrow, right? And so Qatar plays that role in the world, and I think they would argue that they are sort of the uniquely positioned to play that kind of role.
of course. But also the counter argument to that is that now increasingly we hear it from various circles is that basically these channels or these talks are facilitating or allowing the existence of these groups. How strong do you think this argument is?
I mean, I think it's stronger with Hamas right now than it is with any of the other actors, right? I think, we're Qatar to cut off Iran or cut off the Taliban. Those regimes would continue to exist. They would just be a little bit more isolated, right? I don't think they would be brought to collapse. Hamas is a more interesting case, right? Because so much of Hamas's political and leadership infrastructure resides in Qatar.
Mhm.
And so a lot of the nerve center of the organization functions in Qatar. But that arrangement was something that the Israelis were entirely willing to live with before October 7th, right? And I would go a step farther, right? It was an arrangement that they themselves had helped facilitate, right? Remember for a long time, right, the Israelis preferred to deal with Hamas than to deal with the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, because they just found negotiations to be more concrete, more straightforward, more transactional. Less sort of ideologically rift. And so, um, you know, people were willing to live with that arrangement until Hamas really broke out of the constraints that had been imposed upon it.
Yeah.
Um, but then we get into like, what does the future of Hamas really look like at this point? Is it going to be an organization that that governs Palestinians in any sort of consequential way in the future, or is it just going to be an external terrorist organization? And the Israelis are certainly trying to answer that question with the latter. So,
Yep. Yep. Well, enough of Middle East. Let's move on to Indo-Pacific and the China
mhm.
theater. What do you think is going to happen with China? I mean, it's a big question. There are a lot of predictions where we hear a lot of how the US is basically posturing towards a possible conflict with the Chinese, whether that's military or economic or cyber. We don't know how this will evolve. At the same time, there are discussions, there are talks, economics and otherwise. What do you think? At the end of the day, you mentioned previously that you consider China to be a great power. So, what do you
Mhm.
think these two great powers, the United States and Chinese Communist political party, are they going to coexist? Are we going to see a similar episode of a collapse of the Soviet Union type situation in China?
Well, I mean, that's such a huge question. It's a good question. The differences between and if you want to say Cold War One, which was the United States and the Soviet Union, and maybe what's beginning to be Cold War Two, which is the United States and the People's Republic of China, the differences between these two things are immense, right? And the first and most important thing is the size of the Chinese economy, right? China's economic power, economic influence, relevance to the global economy exceeds by vast margins what the Soviets were ever able to bring to the table, right? The Soviet Union was just not very important to the global economy, right? It's still not all that important. It's important as an oil producer, but it was not huge in international markets, was not huge in capital markets. Um, China is different, right? The prosperity, and this is what the tariff war sort of really brings into relief,
Mhm.
stark relief. The prosperity and well-being of everyday Americans, American consumers, is predicated upon stuff that is made in China or stuff that transits through China and has value added in China on its way to the United States. And we can pretend all we want that you can reshore this manufacturing capability from China to the United States, and literally no one believes it, right? Because it's too ridiculous to even assume, right? And so fundamentally, that economic relationship survived Trump 45. It survived Biden 46, who also had a pretty anti-China attitude. And it is persisting into Trump 47.
Mhm.
Um, and I don't see that changing, right? I think that if we had taken a different economic approach to China all the way back to the Obama administration, which had focused on building alternative trading blocks and economic blocks that excluded China,
Mhm.
that might have been something. And right, and we tried to do that with the Trans-Pacific Partnership, but it failed.
Mhm.
The problem with Trump's approach is that you don't cut China out of international markets by placing massive tariffs on everyone all over the world, right? That doesn't hurt China's economic position. It doesn't hurt China's trade position, and arguably it helps China's trade position in a lot of ways, right? Even China can replace the trade it's losing with the United States with trade from other countries that prefer to trade with China because there are fewer tariffs, there's less volatility, et cetera.
Mhm.
Um, and China's economy has significant issues, right? One of them is demographic, but it is also astonishingly prosperous. It is astonishingly prosperous, and it still has a substantial peasant class, right? Much smaller than it was 20 or 30 years, but there is still room to bring people into the high-tech economy. And that's room that you don't have in South Korea, you don't have in Japan, you don't have in the United States. You have in the United States a little bit through mass immigration, but you don't have in Europe, right? You do have in India, right? And maybe we can talk about India in a second, but um, I don't see China taking an economic path that is similar enough to the Soviet Union to be able to expect any kind of Soviet collapse, right? So that's point number one. Point number two, people think that the Soviet Union was just Russia, but it wasn't, right? the collapse of the Soviet Union fundamentally stemmed from, yeah, economic deprivation, yeah, a political class that was unresponsive and oppressive, but most importantly, native rebellions, right? Essentially that the republics that were part of the Soviet Union, by and large, did not want to be part of the Soviet Union anymore. They did not want Russia on their back anymore. And that made it impossible to rescue the Soviet Union. China doesn't have that, right? I mean, China has ethnic groups, but they are so deeply under the thumb of the CCP that, Tibetans are not going to be able to successfully launch a revolution. In Xinjiang, the Uyghurs are not going to be able to successfully launch a revolution, right, in the way that they were in some Soviet republics.
Mhm.
So I don't see much in the way of prospects for a Chinese collapse,
Right.
which means that we have long-term competition between the US and China.
Yeah. And if that is the case, then we'll see continued containment strategy from the US in terms of military postures and everything else. But what if we see an aggression from the Chinese on Taiwan Strait, for example? Do you think, based on your expertise of the US air power, military capabilities, and naval capabilities, under the current leadership, is the US military ready to deter such an aggression?
Well, we're attempting to deter it right now, right? And so the question is increasingly becoming, you know, how much military capability can China bring to this particular theater as rapidly as possible to prevent the United States from being able to deploy its military capability in time to save Taiwan, right? Um, and there's a lot of work in the Pentagon about that right now.
Mhm.
It's really the absolutely the key thing. But what's odd about it is it's a key consideration because it is difficult to think of any other scenario in which China and the United States would fight.
Mm.
Um, this is not, as was the case with the Soviet Union, where we had a huge number of flashpoints, right? And the Fulda Gap in Germany was one, but we also had flashpoints in the Pacific. We had flashpoints in Central Asia and South Asia. We had flashpoints in the Arctic. When people try to come up with conflict scenarios between China and the United States, you have to focus on Taiwan
Yeah.
because the Chinese have made no indication they want anything else that we care about other than Taiwan. Um, Taiwan is a democracy. It's really culturally important to the United States. It should be allowed to remain a democracy. Um, and I think that the United States is correct to make every effort to deter China from retaking Taiwan. But it would really be a catastrophic war, right? It would be a big deal, and it would have long-term effects were the United States to actually step up and attempt to defend Taiwan in a cross-strait assault scenario.
Mm. But we will be able to do so in the current situation.
I think right now, yes. 3 years from now, I mean, the balance is changing that fast.
Mm.
And the kinds of capabilities that China is developing, fifth generation fighters, sixth generation fighters, aircraft carriers, extensive numbers of submarines, right? I mean, all of those make the job more difficult for the United States. I think it would help if the US if the Trump administration were less committed to alienating U.S. allies in the region.
Mm.
The Japanese would help, the South Koreans would help, the Australians would help. But that's not how the Trump administration has decided to approach those countries.
Yeah. Well, for all of the viewers who are interested, you heard what Dr. Farley said. If we in the current arrangement, the way Chinese are building up in the next 3, 4 years, it might be difficult for the US to tackle the possible threat from the Chinese towards Taiwan. So hopefully the leadership in Washington listens and address if there are areas of challenges or issues, and also the suggestions that Dr. Farley had in terms of making sure we have the relevant alliances in the region that is important for us. So maybe we can do a segue towards India. India
Hmm.
right now tiptoeing between their relationship between Russia and United States. And also Pakistan is trying very hard to win over the leadership in the US. Their army chief was in Washington. They've had relationship right now and economic trade announcement that was just made. And also we have Afghanistan that is under control of the Taliban. So the whole South Asia, it seems it's a mixed bag for the current
Hmm.
U.S. leadership. What do you think their priority should be in terms of focusing in the region, to achieve key objectives in terms of U.S. national security interests in the region?
I mean, I think that from the point of view of the United States, India and Pakistan have to be handled very, very carefully. I personally think that the distance that was created between Pakistan and the United States during the War on Terror, the diplomatic distance and really the diplomatic falling out between Pakistan and the United States, was on balance a good thing for the United States. And I don't mean to besmirch Pakistan here, right? Pakistan's a really important country, tremendously important in the region, but India is the bigger prize, right? India is more consistently democratic. There are lots of reasons why the United States tilting in the direction of India makes more strategic sense than tilting in the direction of Pakistan. The origins of those tilts are sort of lost to the history of the Cold War, relationships with the Soviet Union, anti-colonialism, decolonization, and so forth. Um, but Trump 45, Biden 46, and to an extent, Trump 47 have all been committed to this idea that the India-US relationship is an important one. And there has been sort of manifestations of that in terms of technology. We have offered to transfer the F-35 to India, which could be consequential. Um, Modi and President Trump have many of the same ideological priors with respect to nationalism and so forth. Um, and so, those are all the good things, right? But there are reasons for India to want to hedge. One of them is that it's simply not possible for India to detach itself from Russia in the both either the economic or the security spheres, right? India would have to retool its entire defense industrial base, which it has done some of, right? But they would have to retool their entire defense industrial base in order to shift to the West and away from Russia. That's how important the relationship is. The economic relationship is also super important because India buys Russia oil, and that helps float the Russian economy. I think one of the least expected things to happen over the past couple months has been this imposition of they're called secondary tariffs, which is a term that doesn't make any sense, but this imposition of secondary tariffs upon India, right? Because it seems to go against A, Trump's Russia policy, and B, Trump's China policy, and C, Trump's India policy, all at the same time. And and this is something that I really hope that President Trump and the people around him appreciate. India can't be pushed around, right? India views itself as a civilizational pole, right? And as a critical leader of what we used to call the third world, now we call the developing world, blah, 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 right? But India is not going to let itself be pushed around by the United States, right? India, I think, is willing to be a friend to the United States, but it's not going to let itself be pushed around. With respect to Pakistan, I think that they are seeing maybe a glimmer of daylight here, that this is an opportunity to break up what could be a long-term engagement between India and the United States. And so I think they're going to try to exploit that. They nominated Trump for the Nobel Peace Prize, which it flatters his ego, right? And so I think they see this as an opportunity to sort of stick a wedge in this relationship right now. But Trump has to be very careful about this.
Yeah. And what do you think about Afghanistan? I mean, 20 years of the US engagement in Afghanistan, we all went full circle from Taliban to the Taliban once again, and the Taliban that is a host of Al Qaeda, that's a host of all sorts of terrorist groups right now. And right now, this terrorist umbrella that has been created is not just on their own a threat, of course, but also they are closely allied with the Chinese,
Mhm.
with the
Right.
Russians, and with Iranians in the region. What do you think the new leadership in Washington is probably thinking about this? Or we're seeing signs of a shift from the past 4 years of not doing much,
Mhm.
or just continuing to send money and resources and allowing diplomatic maneuverability for the leadership of the Taliban to move around. But this time, we're seeing the new administration is being much more strict about that, cutting all of the financial assistance under various names and brands, but also being more strict in terms of statements, but also sanctions and diplomatically restricting the leadership of the Taliban from moving around. They're only moving or able to move to China or Russia, but not much to other countries. What do you think is going to be the future policy or a new approach from the new administration in terms of dealing and addressing the threat of the Taliban, but also the crisis that's there in Afghanistan of more than 20 million women and girls not having any right whatsoever to go to school, university, or work, and also the broader population who have no right in terms of their livelihood, but also their mass migration, the refugees around the world, and uncertainty towards that country of how it fits in the region and around the world.
Right. I mean, this is something that you know so much more than I do about, but yeah. So what I will say, right? It is very interesting, the difference in policy. I wouldn't put too much into the cutoff of funding, of U.S. funding for NGOs and for USAID and so forth with respect to the Taliban, because I don't think it has anything to do with Afghanistan. I don't think it has anything to do with the Taliban. I think it's a general, sort of a broader, more general approach that is simply affecting Afghanistan in its particular crisis and is likely to have ripple effects there and elsewhere. The travel restrictions are more interesting, right? Because it feels likely to me. This is the likely outcome that I see. Um, that whatever restrictions there may now be on the Taliban's efforts to do diplomacy, right, that the U.S. is imposing, that over time, and especially to the extent that President Trump begins paying attention to them, you will see those kinds of restrictions crumble because there will be an interest in investment in Afghanistan. And especially the Trump administration is really, really interested in rare earths, right? And if they want rare earths, they don't care who's going to mine the rare earths, right? Which is to say that they would prefer to do a deal with the Taliban by which investment would be secured rather than replace the Taliban and try to deal with a new government, right? Um, and so I think, whatever, this administration is only 6 months old, right? 7 months old, right? And so there is a lot of time for them to change, for them to reevaluate. But a transactional approach, which President Trump favors, a deal-making approach, which President Trump favors, I think in the end is going to be him sitting down and saying, we want this from Afghanistan. Who runs Afghanistan? All right, let's make a deal with those people.
Mhm.
That's what I see from this administration. I'm curious if you see that they might do a different approach.
Well, I also see that they're also interested in getting Bagram airfield back. I think is repeatedly President Trump is mentioning it. So basically, streamlining this objective that they have is to go in and making sure that that base is important. I think also for Chinese situation and also other situations that may arise in Central Asia or South Asia. So as you said, of course, there are views that favors transactional approach, but I think they're now shifting towards more of an aggressive approach of alienating the Taliban because I think it's been clear now for the leadership that the Taliban is basically a proxy of the Russian regime because Russia came out and recognized them and looking back in terms of how they have been supporting them, supplying them arms and ammunition and others. Then they have tried for the past 4 years all of the relevant entities to see if they could untangle the Taliban from the bad actors in the region and to distinguish between those who are ideologically leaning extremist terrorists rather than those who are localized factions. And it's been proven difficult, like it's been impossible to distinguish
Mhm.
one from the other because of all of the family ties and relationships and others. And one day they're saying one thing and the next they're saying something else. So I think the in general direction for Washington, the way I see it is moving away from any sort of engagement with the current leadership and or thinking about an alternative for the Taliban. And we'll see how fast that will come about or how that will be shaped. Hopefully, the Afghans in exile, everybody are trying to see if we can have a government in exile be recognized by the United States now that the Taliban is recognized by Russia, and also to have an alternative forces being supported so they could free and liberate parts of Afghanistan, and hopefully soon the whole country, so that we can have a democracy in that region that could be a very important ally of the US in that region moving forward in terms of their struggle that they will have with various powers in the region. So let's see how that will be shaped. Well, Dr. Farley, I mean, before we wrap up the interview, I would like to get your thoughts on what do you think in terms of 3, 4, 5 years from now, if you
Mhm.
look down the road, which area do you recommend for the policymakers in Washington to look closely, that they shouldn't mess, like the way they messed the October 7th attack in Israel? And also for the professionals, those who are studying in various universities across the United States, students of diplomacy and intelligence, you're an educator of this field. What is your recommendation for them to focus on concepts that the current policymakers are probably missing? That hopefully when they come about, they would be able to take on those issues and those
Mhm.
matters into their hands in the fields that they will go into.
I think regionally, South and Southeast Asia are going to be enormously important. We talked about how important India is, but there are a number of other incredibly important, advanced, technologically sophisticated, also with vast poverty, right? But Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, Singapore, these are all remarkably important actors right now. And to the extent that we are projecting even the possibility of great power competition. Great power competition will happen whether we want it to or not, right? It's impossible to like decline great power competition. But South Asia and Southeast Asia are going to be just remarkably important. And so, to the extent that people are working on regional things, the extent that people are working on languages, developing regional expertise, developing expertise in particular trade and industrial areas, this is what they should be looking to, right? Right. This entire space from Afghanistan all the way to Vietnam is, I think, really going to be the crux of is important in its own right, but it's also going to be the crux of relationship with China in the long term. So that is the area. And also, people have to be well-rounded, right? It's not possible just to be a defense intellectual anymore. You have to be defense and trade, and commerce and economics and finance and all of these and technology and AI. And so appreciating how all of these issues work together, I think is sort of really the most important thing for an aspiring professional in this field.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you very much, Dr. Farley, professor at Patterson School, University of Kentucky, a leading scholar on international security and defense, U.S. strategy, an expert on U.S. air power, U.S. naval capabilities, U.S. military. Thank you very much for giving the time for this wide-ranging interview. We covered a lot of areas. I'm sure it will be widely received by the audience and those who are listening, and the policymakers who will be watching this. So thank you very much for your time. And for all of our viewers, this was our episode of the Real Talks with Amini with Dr. Farley. Thank you very much. Until the next episode, God bless you. God bless Afghanistan. God bless the United States, and God bless our world. Thank you.
Thank you.